Welcome to the first part of our new Research Radio special program. The series will focus on Dr. B R Ambedkar and his mission of achieving liberty, equality, and fraternity. I'm Abhishek, and for the next 2 months, every Wednesday, we learn about Dr. Ambedkar's thoughts and actions from scholars across disciplines, from history to literary studies and economics. Through this series, we hope to get closer to the multidisciplinary approach through which Dr. Ambedkar viewed Indian society. Most episodes will offer deep dives into his views on Marxism, Buddhism, Brahminism, patriarchy, the Indian state, and his engagement with Periyar, Jotirao Phule, and others. A handful of episodes will analyze work by scholars who have followed an Ambedkar-inspired approach in their scholarship. To start us off, Chinnai Jangam joins us. Dr. Jangam is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University. His research focuses on the social and intellectual history of Dalits in modern South Asia. He's published several articles in EPW that employ innovative archival research methods, and I recommend reading them. I've shared links to 2 that we discuss in the show notes. Also, do stick around till the end where we'll ask Dr. Jangam a series of rapid-fire questions, which is new for this season. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jangam.
Yes, thank you very much, Abhishek, for inviting me. Jai Bhim to you and Jai Bhim to all the audiences whoever is listening to this podcast.
Yes, Jai Bhim. So, can we start by unpacking what you identify as the biggest challenge in analyzing Dr. Ambedkar? So, you mentioned that in one of your articles that Indian social science holds caste contempt and even quote scholars who subscribe to a revolutionary transformation in India, including Anand Teltumde, use parameters of Marxism to assess Ambedkar instead of placing him in the anti-caste historical lineage, end quote. Could we pass this out?
The way in which Dalit ideas and Dalit engagements and Dalit political articulations are always judged against the various other forms of politics, like particularly Marxism as a very important parameter. People say that, for example, emphasis on caste discrimination and caste-based exploitation ignores the economic aspect of exploitation and economic liberation struggles. But the thing is that, this is a gross misunderstanding of what Ambedkar articulated and how Ambedkar conceived emancipatory struggles. Because in understanding Ambedkar, one of the important things we have to understand is that, he is a man of enlightenment. He was the product of Western enlightenment. He is very well read in Western philosophy. And second thing is that, he was also rooted in anti-caste historical tradition. And that's what, when we are trying to assess Ambedkar as a philosopher and intellectuals, one of the important ways we have to see is that to see him as this product of enlightenment, but very much rooted in the historical anti-caste traditions. So unless you look at this and see him as a person of his own stature and a philosopher who articulated a different kind of emancipatory struggle, we cannot understand Ambedkar well. Because, if you try to judge him from the perspective of Marxism or perspective of liberalism or perspective of any sort of ideological tools, what we see is that, we only will be able to grasp him partially, not as a full philosopher and intellectual who basically dared to question the dogmatism, and also the person who even tried to reinterpret Buddhism to suit the needs of particularly emancipatory struggles. That's one of the reasons why the way he basically wrote Buddha and his Dharma, for example, goes against all conventional understanding of Buddhism. In fact, he had revolutionarily interpreted and tried to see emancipatory struggles which can combine both spiritual emancipation, social equality, and also economic liberation. So in this context, what I see is that, Ambedkar needs to be seen as this thinker of his own stature with his own ways of understanding the world.
Can we actually go deeper into the example that you gave of his use of Buddhism to understand, what is a more appropriate way of locating Ambedkar?
Ambedkar not only trained in Western enlightenment, but also he was a scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He was an economist, he was a jurist trained in law, and he was also very deeply read in religious studies. And, like this way, what happens is that, as an intellectual and also as an ideologue, his way of understanding of world comes from these multiple readings of different disciplines. And that's one of the reasons why his insights, both intellectual and also historical insights, are much more deeply entrenched in terms of the way he interprets even the Siddhartha, the Gautama or Buddha. The figure of Gautama Buddha itself basically changes in the hands of Ambedkar. The way he looks at and the way he transforms this fundamental tenets of Buddhism to suit the emancipatory struggles of the oppressed like Dalits in India is very unique way of looking at. For example, if we want to really interconnect Ambedkar's emancipatory interpretation of Buddhism with other liberation theologies, either in Catholicism or even for that matter, philosophers like Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam, one of the important things is that the way they bring the pragmatic aspects of liberation and this world problems into the spiritual liberation struggles. So that's why he sees individual and community are connected, and you cannot have individual liberation unless you have a common emancipation as a community.
Mhm. And I liked how you brought in his multidisciplinary background and training. And as somebody who is interested in the social and intellectual history of Dalits in South Asia, I wanted to get a better understanding of what the archive looks like for you, and how your training across different countries has influenced your research process.
Yes, thank you, Abhishek, for asking this very important question. How does a Dalit archive look? One of the important things, like even as a historian, when I started my research, one of the important challenges I faced that there were this conventional understanding that there are not many sources about Dalits. When I started my PhD and in England, I remember the second day of my arrival in London at British Library, I went to this lady who does this archives of South Asia, particularly South Indian languages. I went to her and asked, ma'am, I'm working on Dalits in India. I would like to know what kind of sources are here. And that lady, looks at me and says, do you mean scheduled caste? I said, yes, scheduled caste. She looked at me up and down and, are you also scheduled caste? I said, yes. Then she said, on my face that, there are nothing is available in this library on scheduled caste. I remember, I was like collapsed almost, almost, I didn't know how to react because that was the second day of my life in London. And I came with a lot of ambition to do PhD in England. And suddenly I come to the library and the librarian tells me that there is nothing to work on. And I almost, had tears in my eyes and went back to my supervisor next day and told him that this is what his name is Peter Robb. So I remember he looked at me, and when I went to his office and he took me to coffee and made me sit in the canteen, and I explained to him this is what my experience is. And he said, Chinna, you just came from all the way struggling so much from India to here, and see that this is also one of the challenges. Who said there is nothing in the library? Because the entire British library consists of all the colonial archives in India and colonial experience. That means that there's a lot to explore. And he told me, just next 3 months, you just go and look at the catalogs of the British Library, and particularly in South Asia. I remember 3 months I sat and looked at the catalogs. And then, I made so much of bibliography on only concentrating on Dalits, particularly South India and Telugu archives. And I was very shocked. So much is there in British Library, particularly starting from East India Company onwards to till British left India. You see that it's unbelievable archive exists, but very little has been focused on. Then I went and showed it to my supervisor. He said, you can write 100 PhDs on this. So like it's that's kind of material exists. The problem is that one needs a perspective to look into it. Like that's what even Anne Stoller, historian and anthropologist at New School for Social Research, she has this very interesting argument and idea that reading against the grain, and where by reading the dominant narratives, the way in which they describe people below them and with contempt and condescending nature, one can exactly read opposite way the politics of the oppressed. And the other way to look at archives, like particularly in relation to Dalits, is the whole idea of caste histories. Like there is this old tradition, both oral and also social memory, oral histories and oral traditions, and also social memory as a very important tradition, in which folk tradition becomes very important part of Dalit experience. And very little has been worked on, particularly the folk tales and folk narratives and oral traditions of the Dalits. And particularly in South India, where I come from, in Telangana, we have this tradition called satellite castes. Satellite castes are dependent castes within Dalits. There are these small communities who are dependent on the dominant Dalit communities, whose responsibility historically is to narrate the caste histories or caste Puranas. Like these communities are like social archive for these Dalit communities. And nothing has been, very little has been done. Like, I know there is one is to, folklorist called Subhachari. He did this very interesting book in Telugu on Kula Puranalu or caste Puranas. So like that way, what you see is that the archive is rich. The only thing is that what we need to do is that the attention to details and attention to understanding these histories and bring them into mainstream perspective is very, very important part of challenge we face in terms of engaging with the archives.
Yes, yes. I think your article, Dalit or Chronicles from the Telugu Country,
Yeah,
is perhaps one of the PhD, I guess, brief, concise versions of a PhD, if I can say that,
that's right.
where it's a really fascinating article where you look at the relationship between Dalits and the communist and the I mean, not so much the Congress
Yeah,
party,
yeah,
but the struggles and the relationship and how you use the colonial archives of the magistrates.
yeah.
So that was like, if there anything you'd like to say about that research process and the archive with that?
Yeah, in fact, thank you for bringing that up, particularly that old story, like no Nandori Subara, I forgot his name, like exactly, but the Dalit communist who was basically prosecuted even after independence, and he was made to forced to say that he's not a communist by the state. But thing is that the entire life struggle of this man, particularly is both cultural engagement and communist organizing, was based on the colonial archive. In fact, magisterial inquiries and special investigation department of CID of Madras presidency had huge files on this man, because he was so popular among especially peasants and lower caste people, that whenever he used to have any performances, people used to go to his performances even in the middle of the night, and state had lot of difficulty tracking this man. So that's like that's what, like one of the, in fact, when I got hold of this file, in fact, in British Library, about this man, and I remember coming back to Chennai and again going to state archives in Chennai, and it's unbelievable kind of information about this man, particularly comes from this so-called poor and deprived background, but state had to maintain such a huge file to prosecute this man. So that's what, like, it's a very interesting thing about these sort of archival reading against the grain, is that one can really write the histories of the struggles, the courageous struggles of the oppressed people against the dominance and oppression, is using the dominant archives, like for example judicial documents and also police inquiries. They provide a fascinating window into the way in which history has been transformed by these people.
Yeah, yeah. And I maybe this is a good time to transition to the project that you're working on currently, which is the memoir on your mother, and separately on the everydayness of caste experiences. So maybe if we can discuss the approach that you took with these studies before getting into the Dr. Ambedkar specific questions.
This project on my mother is going on for some time. I started writing for very long. I don't know whether you know it or not. My mother, she was a Jogini. Joginis are women, especially for coming from Dalit backgrounds, who are dedicated to the local gods and goddesses, who do not have husbands. They are supposed to be the it's like in any other situation, like exploitation of the women is part of the caste tradition. But what happens is that the Jogini women comes in much more worse situation, because they are at the receiving end both from the dominant caste and also from the Dalit men themselves. So in this context, their experience of sexual exploitation and gender discrimination and the mistreatment by the mainstream society and Dalit society adds further problem, not only for themselves but the children who are born to them. So that's one of the reasons why for very long in my life I was very scared to tell that my mother was a Jogini to others. And in fact, I started telling that about my mother only after I think I got my job as a professor. So then one that made me really look back, like, is it the fault of my mother or is it the fault of the system? Then when I re-looked at, and because of my exposure to caste histories and the way in which things have transformed, then I felt my mother was not guilt at all. She was courageous woman who brought us up, and made me I am today talking to you precisely because of her sacrifices. And another important thing is that as a growing up boy, and because my mother was a single mother and did not have husband, I was able to see very closely, particularly the way she struggled, especially to raise me as a child without father. And the second thing is that her own challenges of uh, overcoming the both sexual and also social exploitation by men of different communities, including Dalits. So this is what I felt. I thought my mother's story is worth telling to the world. That if I don't tell the story of my mother, our story will go away. Like her, millions of women, particularly coming from Dalit backgrounds, and who basically struggle to raise their children, but they end up having no histories of their struggles and the way in which they brought us to this world and made us what we are today.
Yes, yeah, that's a difficult process, I'm
Yeah,
sure, even while writing it.
yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I'm having a lot of challenge in terms of narrating this story, like, because at one level it's painful, but it's also liberating. It's painful to remember, and memory is always painful, right? Especially if it is a bad memory, and which involves a lot of violence and various forms of unwanted things. So it's painful, but also at one level, telling that story, it's like a therapeutic and also very liberative, and it liberates myself and also my mother and my family.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. To transition to, I think, a more general, perhaps, lens of looking at things, if we can look at how you view Dr. Ambedkar's research methods in books and essays where he's taken a historical approach in understanding, South Asian political economy, and maybe we can look at one or two examples that you feel like shed light on his approach.
Yeah, like Ambedkar, as I said in the beginning, that he was trained in multiple disciplines, and though he was not a trained historian, but because of his involvement in multiple disciplines, one of the important things you see that he has this very interesting knack for sources, knack for reading the sources, and also the way he tries to look at history, and uh, he combines his intuitiveness of understanding history with the sources. That's what very fascinating thing about him. Like you mentioned in the question about who were shudras, but also other than that, if you look at his book, who are untouchables and where they come from, and also the annihilation of caste. In fact, annihilation of caste, though it is written as a speech for a to deliver, but one of the important thing is that it is very significant historical source in terms of the way we understand caste today, and particularly from the point of view of anti-caste perspective. And if you really want to dismantle the intellectual roots of caste, one of the ways to do is by reading annihilation of caste. And that's why, like, one of the reasons why Ambedkar, like for example, emphasizes the idea of textual tradition, particularly the Brahminical textual tradition, as the basis for caste ideology. And that's one of the reasons why he rereads and reinterprets and also critically engages with texts like Mahabharata, Ramayana, Puranic texts, and also he burns Manudharma Shastra because that provides the justification. So in this context, what we see is that Ambedkar is a very historically rooted scholar, and particularly his whole idea of rooting himself in historical sources and also religious understanding is very critical for the idea of him weaving a liberation struggles. So in this context, he remains a very important. Sadly, what we see is that in South Asian scholarship, particularly till very recently, historians, not only historians, even no one has taken him seriously as a worthy of any intellectual engagement. But now with the anti-caste scholarship and anti-caste politics picking up, particularly in the context of what is happening in 2014, afterwards Modi's rise to power and also the rise of Hindu right. One of the important thing is that the only way one can produce the antidote to Hindu fundamentalism is through critical engagement with Ambedkar's writings, both politically and also in terms of rewriting the histories.
Yeah, and as someone who's some of your research work has straddled different continents, and as somebody who's also interested in these interconnections with South Asia and the rest of the world, I was curious about your perspective and Dr. Ambedkar's understanding of the similarities and differences between race and caste.
In fact, in Annihilation of Caste, one of the important arguments Ambedkar brings out is that there is no connection between race and caste. And in fact, he refutes the idea of racial interpretation of caste, and he says that race and caste do not go together, and racial interpretation of history doesn't apply to the context of understanding of caste. Where what he sees that he tries to root the local histories of caste and its evolution in terms of socio-cultural and historical phenomena. But one of the important limit, I think this is where I find the limitations of Ambedkar in understanding the history. He did not critically engage with the history of colonialism. Particularly, he did not see the role of colonialism in remaking of the caste. How basically Brahminism and colonialism together, they solidify caste in India, and the way in which they together it like colonial project of social ordering or bringing order to society, it happens in alliance with Brahmins or Brahminical pandits. But that Ambedkar did not see that. In fact, the way in which the caste society gets remade in the context of colonial society, and how caste becomes a template for racial oppression across the world. That's why you see that the very word caste comes from Portuguese word. It's not an Indian word.
Mhm. Yeah, I think perhaps this is maybe linked to Jotirao Phule,
Yes,
who he was, inspired by greatly, and who also was at different moments in time optimistic and extremely skeptical and even antagonistic against the openings that the colonial state could offer. Yeah,
that's true. To add to that, Abhishek, yes, you thanks for bringing up about Pule, and that's what, like, the difference. I think this is where Pule is much more innovative. Mahatma Pule, precisely because he was able to see that connection between Brahminism and colonialism, how they worked in collaboration with each other, and that's where, in fact, that in understanding that, Pule is much more forward looking compared to Ambedkar. Ambedkar's engagement with colonialism is that he knew the limitations of colonialism, because it is always in support of the dominant caste and dominant communities of India. But but he never saw them in terms of the role of colonialism in entrenching the power of the dominant caste. There is this misconceived notion that among particularly Dalit activists and scholars, that colonialism emancipated Dalits. It is not true, right? Colonialism as a system, colonialism as a power, colonial empire was built for profit, not for some great ideal social emancipatory agendas. They did not have any agenda of emancipation of oppressed, or they did not come into India to spread some message of social equality, or all these things. So colonialism is driven by the profit, it's not driven by the social transformation.
right, right. And this is maybe particularly strange also. I know we are digressing slightly, but
Mm.
because he also stayed in the colonial powers, and had correspondence also with like E.B. Du Bois,
Yeah,
and so I think there's a lot of more research that's possibly there for scholars to pick up on, and
yeah,
tell us more about what's going on there.
yeah.
Yeah, so just transitioning to the part about about Brahminical spirituality.
Mm.
One quote I found quite fascinating in one of your articles is that, as Ambedkar pointed out, the roots of caste lie in the Hindu Brahminical spirituality that produces caste practice as a mental frame, and any theory that does not uproot that mental belief will never annihilate caste. End quote. So, can we spend some time discussing this and unpacking it?
The mental frames of the people for thousands of years are trained in a way that they have to accept their caste status or oppressed status as a fate rather than a thing which they can really transform. And in this context, what you see is that the way in which the religious ideology plays a very, very important role in reproducing the way in which this caste society uninterruptedly continues, despite intervention of Islam, Christianity, and all these religions come and go, but the foundational structures of caste remain as it is, precisely because the power of religious ideology. And in this context, what you see is that Ambedkar sees that that's one of the reasons why he sees Buddhism as an alternative to Hinduism, precisely because it offers an alternative frame of mind, and it offers an alternative way of thinking. And I think this is where like, unless we have this ideological perspective and ideological worldview, which basically completely liberates one from the influence of Hinduism, one cannot really have a caste free society, because the fundamental ethos and the principles of Brahminical Hinduism relies on this belief that caste is the foundation on which society needs to be built. That's why Hinduism doesn't believe in equality. It doesn't have a sense of human equality, and it doesn't feel that like, even in the eye of God, human beings are not equal in Hinduism or a Brahminical Hinduism. That's why what we need is that we need to frame a different kind of ethic, the ethic of equality, which basically comes outside Hinduism, outside Brahmanism.
Right, right, right. I'm glad that you brought out the role of Buddhism. And if we can maybe discuss the appropriation of Ambedkar by both the right and the left, it's increasingly being talked about and being made visible. But as a historian, if there are any, if you see any continuities with this method, and we can maybe start by understanding what appropriation means, and the significance of why we even need to identify it as something of a concern.
The idea of appropriation, like, what happens is that it's not just Ambedkar. Even people like Gandhi gets appropriated, right? Modi, for example, uses Gandhi as a very important way to reach out to the world leaders. In fact, the post-independent India's nation states biggest diplomatic ways in which they try to build this PR network outside the world is Gandhi, right? Gandhi becomes a very important emblem of this, going out to countries and tell that, we are a country of peace and we love people and all those things. But in reality, what you see is that, Indian state was never peaceful. And in fact, it waged wars against its own people for, decades together against, indigenous people, and the violence against Dalits. And we also have series of, every decade had, riots against Muslims, and which again, state played an active role in perpetuating these violences. This is what I think state and also the ruling class is good at. Like, it tries to use every avenues to, put forward its agenda of rule. And in this context, what happens is that, till 1990s, no one even mainstream never even acknowledged that there is a figure called Ambedkar. But anti-Mandal context and the way in which Dalits became assertive, particularly in the context of Kanshiram Mayawati's Bahujan Samaj Party, and also even before that, what we see that, the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra. Like, you see that, whenever Dalits become a politically force to reckon with, mainstream could not. One thing is that it cannot ignore it anymore. And then, especially in the context of electoral politics of numbers, and one of the important ways in which you do that, Ambedkar becomes a very important symbolic figure for Dalits. Like, that's a problem. Like, the way in which, instead of reading Ambedkar and understanding his ideology of liberation, even Dalit leadership, one of the important thing is that, they do the worship culture. This worship culture, what happens is that, becomes a very important ploy, alibi for the ruling elites, like, BJP, for example. Like, Ambedkar stands against everything BJP and RSS stands for. Like, nowhere you see that, they have any alignment, neither in terms of, social philosophy in our politics. There's nothing, one can really see that, they have any sort of similarity. But what happens is that, the same Hindu right, because it wants to use Dalit vote bank as a very important way to, like, in consolidation of the so-called Hindu identity. In fact, that's one of the dangers of this Hindu right politics, is that, the way it is trying to bring this whole idea of Hindu right, Hindu community, and particularly pitting against the Muslim and the Christian communities, and the way in which it is trying to demonize minority communities and try to breed, put together this whole idea of Hindu community. And in which one of the important thing is that, again, the old Brahminical idea of, putting Brahminical, philosophy and supremacy as a very important way to reorganize the society. That's one of the reasons why this politics of appropriation, particularly, it is more dangerous for Dalits than to the dominant caste. Because what happens is that, for dominant Brahminical ideology, it survives. That's what it historically, what you see is that, throughout human history, like, particularly from ancient to now, despite challenges, despite disruptions, one of the important thing is that, Brahmanism has a very good knack to adjust itself to the changing times. And that's what, like, the way it appropriates. Like, for example, the whole idea of vegetarianism, it comes from Buddhist and Jain tradition. It's not an Hindu tradition. Like, that's what, like, Vaishnavite, belief system of, vegetarianism is an appropriation of Buddhism and Jainism. And in fact, not only that, historically, if you look at the major temples in southern India, they were all former Jain and Buddhist temples. So in this context, what you see that, like, the Brahmanism has this very interesting, tendency to appropriate. And that's one of the reasons why, like, it appropriation, not only in spiritual appropriation, even social appropriation. The way in which historically it assimilated the, particularly communities which are outside the purview of, Chaturvarna framework. For example, like, indigenous, Adivasi communities, when they are in rule, particularly the Gondwana rulers, for example, in Western India, a central and Western Indian context, what you see that they're all, assimilated as what we call the Kshatriya caste. And it also happens even in the context of what we call the post-independent India, like, where the Sudra communities who have become politically dominant are getting assimilated into the dominant caste framework. Like, for example, Kammas in Andhra Pradesh, Reddis in Andhra Pradesh, and for that matter, various dominant Shudra communities are now almost, taken into the purview of this Hindu Brahminical ideology.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything you'd like to say about the left perspective as well?
Yeah, left perspective, that's what, like, one of the important things about challenges about particularly mainstream left is that, it's failure to, appreciate and reread Ambedkar not only has a critical social perspective in terms of understanding caste, but also I think, Ambedkar also has a very interesting way of reinterpreting economic transformation in Indian history. I think in that context, people like D.D. Kosambi, for example, who comes from the Marxist tradition and closely aligns to what Ambedkar interpreted the transformations in Indian history. And that way, what you see is that the way in which evolution of caste, and also the way in which that is closely aligned to the appropriation of economic surplus from these producing communities, is very critical in rereading and reinterpreting the Indian history. I think that's where the left needs to really engage critically, particularly the Marxian tradition, but to combine this anti-caste perspective of Ambedkar into anti-capitalist and also larger liberation struggles.
And throughout this conversation, we're probably hinting at the really extensive research that you have been doing. And one of your projects, I guess, that would come across that is a part of this extensive history that you're doing, is your goal of tracing the history of caste over a long period.
Yes.
So if you can tell us more about this and share your progress so far, any questions that are really propelling you forward.
Yes, thank you. Like one of the important things, like again, reading Ambedkar was very important inspiration for me, and also because I'm an historian and also who's trying to understand the social history of India, and which again has closer resemblance both in terms of economic transformations and intellectual formations. And for me, like I'm a historian engaged in modern Indian history, but for me, well, like these modern Indian history cannot be read in isolation from what happened in pre-modern world, and particularly when we want to look at the history of caste and social transformations in India. I think like a large scholarship on both sociological, anthropological, and also to some extent historical research on modern India looks at history of caste with the coming of the Europeans. For example, like post-colonial. In fact, yesterday I was talking to. I just delivered a lecture yesterday exactly at this time at the University of Pennsylvania, entitled "Decolonizing Caste." One of the fundamental arguments I'm trying to make is that the template of caste, which has been developed somewhere in Rigvedic period and afterwards Gupta time and other things. What you see is that these template continues even into post-independent India without any disruptions. Though what we see is that there are this whole idea that we have Islamic rule has come to India and they ruled for almost 600-700 years, and after that British came and ruled for 300 years. All these things, but what you see is that under invisible frame on which all these political dynasties were able to thrive and succeed and extract the surplus from people was this idea that caste-based society. In fact, one of the important argument I'm trying to make in my book is that when the early modern period, like after 15th century, when Indian subcontinent becomes the global market, in which basically the Indian economy almost supplying enormous cotton textiles and spices and other goods to the world markets and becoming very important attractions for Europeans. One of the important thing is that it is predicated on caste based free labor. Like what happens is that the majority of the lower caste people were not paid any sort of remuneration for the labor they are undertaking. And in fact, that's what the artisans, like in cotton textile industry, or even for that matter various other artisanal communities, were obligated by the caste to supply goods freely for the dominant caste. And same thing happens in agriculture labor, that majority of the Dalits were not paid in any sort of remuneration for the labor they are delivering to the in cultivation and producing the crops. So in this context, what happens is that there is a massive discount in terms of the labor provided by these people for the dominant caste to play in the world markets and bring money, make profits out of it. So in this context, what happens is that the colonial disruption, what it does is that it basically makes it much more visible for the world that these are the foundations. And that's one of the reasons why I think when Europeans come to Indian subcontinent, particularly Portuguese, were very baffled with the witnessing the social differences in terms of caste and other differences. So one of the important aspect the Europeans find is that the efficient seamlessness through which caste is operating, especially the way it is facilitating the extra surplus extraction from the land and also from artisanal communities, and without much violence, and also with the consent of the people. That's where I think we talked about the idea of mental domination, or mental, the way in which spiritual domination operates in legitimizing the caste. So in this context, what you see is that unlike in settler colonial societies like in North America, you don't witness genocide in India by the Europeans. Instead, what they do is that they assimilate the dominant Brahminical groups into the colonial structures of power, And that's one of the reasons why when colonialism and Brahminism combine together, the caste oppression becomes manifolds. And that's when British and were able to extract surplus without much violence in India. That's one of the reasons why the colonial census and the way in which these various forms of knowledge production related to social operations happens, precisely because this order is very, very profitable for them. Because the without even any sort of violence and without their direct involvement, on behalf of them, the dominant castes are helping them to extract the surplus and also run the colonial society.
Mm-hmm. And it's also like a more modern form of capitalism that
Yes,
it's
yeah,
combining with as well.
that's right, capitalism. And that's one of the reasons why, to add to this, Abhishek, that what happens is that caste becomes a template for racism. And that's one of the reasons why, earlier we mentioned that how the caste based oppressive structures will become an important emulative models for racialized societies, like for example lynchings for sexual violations, or even for that matter interracial sexual relationships and marriages. The way in which lynchings happen in Southern America, it's modeled on caste society, like in villages, when people have what do you call, trespass the caste boundaries and have sexual relationship with the dominant, like for example lower caste man having relationship with the dominant caste women, leads to enormous violence and killing. That's one of the ancient models of caste discipline, which gets emulated and implemented in racialized societies.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think we'll like to end with a quick rapid fire round where we have three questions, and nothing that's supposed to quiz you, but where you can keep your answers as uh, powerful and as brief as possible. So, are you ready for the first question?
That's right. Chep, tell me.
Yeah. So, what's one aspect of Dr. Ambedkar's writing or actions that you'd like to learn more about?
Oh, it's personal life.
Okay. Any particular part of it?
We only know Ambedkar both as an engaged politician and also scholar who basically spent all his life, doing political movements and organizing. But we know very little about his personal life. Especially, I think Dhananjay Kir's biography, not much. Even that doesn't shed much light on his personal life. And it would be interesting to know what kind of person he was. And I know, in fact, that's something I really want to research on. Basically, the personal relationships he had and the kind of person he was, what, like it's very important to know how human he was as a human being, because we all have emotions, and how his emotions were, and that is something I'm very curious about in life. Because
Something you're skeptical about in his work?
skeptical about his whole understanding of colonialism.
Okay. One recommendation to further and unify fragmented social movements.
Recommendation is to read Ambedkar more.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Chinaya Jangam, for joining us on Research Radio. It was a
Yeah, I
pleasure.
just want to make one concluding
Yes,
remark.
please do.
Yeah, the way in which, like, the one of the important thing I want to make as a final round or concluding remarks is that the only way to disrupt dominant Brahminical narrative is to bring the politics of the oppressed as a counter narrative of inquiry, and dismantling structures of power that have been showed up by the classical tradition will require more than fact checking. It will require writing an entirely new story about antiquity and about who we are today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us, Chinaya Jangam, and for those parting words as well.
Thank you, and happy Dalit History Month, and Jai Bhim to everyone, and including you. Take care and stay safe.
Yes, Jai Bhim as well. So, what did you think of our conversation? What's your experience been like accessing the archive? Do reach out to us via any of EPW's social media accounts. I hope you subscribe to the podcast and join us in our journey to explore the multiple dimensions of Dr. Ambedkar's thought and practice one week after another. Take care, and I'll see you next week.